Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this short webinar on hybrid sampling. My name is Mansoor Fahimi. I am the Executive Vice President and Chief Data Scientist at the Marketing Systems Group, and I welcome you to this webinar. Before we start, I should mention that by nature, this topic is fairly technical. But I have done my best to keep the math to a minimum and focus on implementation and again, keep the math to a minimum. Also, I recognize that this is not a webinar on non-probability sampling techniques. However, since when it comes to hybrid sampling, most often we use probability and non-probability samples together. On and off, I will make some references to non-probability samples and issues that one needs to be careful about when dealing with non-probability samples, especially those from online panels. Lastly, I want to mention that this is a pre-recorded session, so I will be happy to answer any questions that you may have if you send them to me via email, which I will share at the end of the presentation. So with that, let's get started. This presentation is going to, This presentation is going to include what I would call the big picture, and I will explain shortly what I mean by that. Then we get to some of the new realities in today's survey research world that encourage us to think outside of the traditional survey research toolbox and think about alternatives, hybrid sampling being one of those. Then we get to the meat of this presentation, which is hybrid sampling, what it is, at least the way I define this topic. We'll talk about available inferential machinery that is available to us, and then talk about what's needed to make this whole concept to work. And then I will end with a few takeaways as part of the summary. So the big picture is that I have made it a habit that any presentation that I have on survey research, I would start with a reminder that when we design and administer surveys, we need to have a holistic view and don't focus only on areas that are of interest or comfort to us. We need to be paying attention to all sources of error, those that come from sampling side, those that come from data collection side, those that come from processing side, and those that come from analysis and reporting. Otherwise, we will end up with weak links that can undermine the integrity of the entire survey. So this presentation is mostly focused on sampling, but it is important to recognize that there are other sources of error that we need to be aware of. So what are some of the new realities that we are dealing with? This should be fairly known to all of you. So we are dealing with issues that have to do with coverage issues with traditional methods. We'll talk about what I mean by traditional methods shortly. Survey response rates are declining, steadily declining, and this is like salt on the wound. And then there are other contributing factors that we need to be aware of, such as time and budget constraints, which may not be an issue for large government surveys, but for the majority of surveys, it is an issue. It seems like more and more we have to do more with less. And then, of course, there are some growing analytical or data needs that may be beyond the reach of traditional or structured surveys that open the door to these alternative methods. And in general, I think it's fair to assume that purism in survey sampling is becoming a thing of the past, because on the one hand, traditional pure methods have issues. On the other hand, these alternative methods are becoming more and more attractive. So in terms of traditional methods, I think for the most part, it's fair to say that there are two sort of gold standard methods that we currently use for survey sampling. Dual frame random digit dialing or address-based sampling. Dual frame or DFRDD has some coverage issues due to exclusion of less productive 100 series landline banks, as well as the less productive 1000 series blocks. And then this situation becomes even more pronounced when we deal with surveys that are below the national level. So at the state level, there are some non-ignorable coverage issues, particularly with the cellular frame. And these coverage problems become really serious as the geography narrows, for example, when you have a county level type survey. On the address-based sampling side, although it's a fairly trusted methodology, there are issues in terms of coverage of this methodology, specifically in terms of certain address types that are often excluded: seasonal addresses, educational addresses, vacant and PO boxes. And there are studies that show that even though we exclude such addresses from our samples, oftentimes they end up having eligible occupied units that should have otherwise been included. And then there are other issues in terms of coverage, such as drop points that are comprised of drop units. Think of high-rises or gated communities where the delivery sequence file has information up to the point, but doesn't have specific address information for units that are behind that point. So together, it's becoming somewhat cost prohibitive to use dual frame RDD or address-based sampling because of the issues that were mentioned. And these are some of the realities that are giving rise to the interest in alternative methods, hybrid sampling being one of them. So this slide basically shows one of the statements that I shared earlier. Response rates are declining, and I don't have to preach to the choir. We know that response rates are declining. This is from the BRFSS, which is the largest phone study in the US, and as you see, response rates are declining over time. I should also mention that 40%, 46% response rates are dream for most of the surveys, but many of the surveys don't have the luxury, the budgetary luxury of having the significant refusal conversion that BRFSS uses to reach this level of response rate. Nonetheless, response rates are declining. Also, this slide shows the declining rate of response to address-based methods for a particular panel that uses ABS for recruitment. Again, it is undeniable that response rates that are declining, and going from 12% to 8% may not seem like a huge decline, but by the time you factor in that for large recruitments, oftentimes large samples are used for the initial mail out, and most of these mail outs include some kind of non-contingent incentive, $1, $2, $5, so money can add up quite a bit, even if there is even 1% drop in the overall recruitment rate. So let's get to the topic. What is hybrid sampling? As far as I'm concerned, or at least the way I'm going to be looking at this topic, hybrid sampling includes blending samples together. This could be supplementing probability-based samples with probability samples, such as mixing dual frame RDD and ABS. But the focus is mostly on when we combine probability samples with non-probability samples. This is mostly what's referred to as hybrid sampling when, because of cost reasons that we will get into shortly, we will supplement probability samples with non-probability samples. There are also situations where for longitudinal studies, for example, because pure longitudinal surveys are becoming cost prohibitive, future surveys are conducted by replenishing the sample with fresh cross-sectional samples to deal with attrition that is becoming more and more a serious problem. When it comes to blended samples, it's important to note that such samples do not need to, well, let me step back. They need to be representing the same target population, and they need to be fairly conducted at the same time so that we don't have any temporal lurking effects. However, when you blend samples, they don't need to be based on identical sampling design, nor do they need to rely on a common modality for data collection. So in general, as I mentioned, what is fairly common these days is that you have a modest probability-based sample, and these samples are often fairly expensive, and you supplement that with a larger sample, mostly from non-probability samples, and oftentimes from online panels, and that's again the focus of this presentation. Samples from online panels, again, this is not a topic on online panels or non-probability sampling, but it's important to point out some of the related issues. When it comes to online panels, there are two, generally speaking, types of panels. One type of panel are those that rely on probability-based methods for recruitment, and there are only a handful of panels that qualify as such. The vast majority of online panels that we use these days are those that rely on non-probability methods and don't have what I would refer to as organic representation, because they rely on every which way to recruit panel members. And most of these panels oftentimes mix and match various panels to accommodate the survey needs. Many of these panels don't have any profile data for sample balancing. And if you have ever dealt with one of these panel providers, you would know that oftentimes they have very limited experience and infrastructure for complex sampling. So what is the big deal about these non-probability samples? As I mentioned, they often lack organic representation. This is a study that we conducted a few years ago showing that when you have a non-probability sample and you weight this sample to basic geodemographic distributions, there are still a whole bunch of measures that are going to lack external validity. They have bias. And there is a long list of items that such samples can produce biased estimates for. And therefore, it's important to be cognizant of that when you blend probability samples with non-probability samples. All right, now let's get to the machinery, the inferential machinery that is available to us for blending samples. Thanks to giants such as Niemann, we have at our disposal this simple inferential tool. Basically, when there is a universe from which we can select sample where units have known selection probabilities, and we can secure either perfect response rates or non-response happens to be random, somewhat academic, nonetheless, that's the paradigm. We would be able to make inferences, measurable inferences about the population, the target population based on the sample through the magic of weighting. And throughout the years, we have actually learned to deal with some of the practical limitations that we often encounter during the survey administration, such as differential non-response. As we all know, non-response is never random and it is always differential in nature, but we have developed techniques that deals with differential non-response. And the reality that we are facing these days as relates to this presentation is that oftentimes we're going to have to sample from universes that don't have a complete coverage. And samples that are selected from such universes are therefore not random. Selection probabilities are not known. And on top of that, we have the differential non-response. So this basic idea of taking a sample, applying weights to them, and being able to produce measurable inferences becomes more and more challenging. Now let's talk about sample mixology, which is at the heart of this presentation. I would like to start by mentioning that a common practice whereby samples from different surveys are blended together in a linear fashion, basically stacking up these samples, is not optimal, and it has some serious issues. It turns out that optimal blending of samples requires a particular process whereby these samples are blended together proportional to their representativity, and I will be explaining what I mean by that shortly. Another way of saying is that we want to blend the samples proportional to their weighting efficiency. Ultimately, what this means is that we want to give louder voice to respondents that come from probability-based samples, those who have organic representation. The methodology that I'm going to share with you is basically based on my own dissertation back in 1989. I provided an abridged version of that at the JSM back in 1994, and we have a somewhat more fleshed out version of that as a white paper here at MSG that we will be happy to share with you if you ask that by email. So to start with, and this is a little bit of inevitable math that I need to share with you. Let's think about a situation where we have two independent samples. One is of size N1 and another one is size N2. And each of these samples are used to produce some population estimates of some population parameter, let's say some population mean. So sample 1 produces estimate of population mean, call it Y bar 1, and sample 2 produces estimate of the same population mean, call it Y bar 2. Instead of reporting based on these individual surveys, in other words, using either Y bar 1 or Y bar 2, mathematically we can show that you can do better by combining these two estimates in a linear fashion and produce the so-called composite estimate. So here we are taking a chunk of Y bar 1 and the complement is coming from Y bar 2, and without getting into a lot of mathematical niceties, it can be shown that the optimal value of this composition factor is going to be a function of the mean squared errors of these point estimates. What is mean squared error? Just to refresh, it's basically the variance of the point estimate plus the square of its bias. So this is the basic tool that we have at our disposal for blending samples together. Now, this looks a little complicated, so let me simplify it a little for you. If we can assume that each of these individual surveys, in this case, we have two independent surveys, one of size N1, one of size N2, if we can assume that these are producing unbiased estimates, this can come as a natural byproduct of probability samples, or if we have a non-probability sample, we can assume that we can weight the sample and do our best to eliminate as much of the bias as possible so that this tool becomes available to us. Under this assumption, it can be shown that that optimal composition factor simply becomes a function of the variance of these point estimates. And if we can make a little bit of extra assumption that the variance or the variability of these estimates coming from the two samples are not hugely different, then this composition factor becomes simply a function of what we refer to as unequal weighting effect, or some people refer to it as design effect, and sample sizes. And then given that these unequal weighting effects are survey-based, we also make another simplifying assumption and use the survey level approximation of the design effect or unequal weighting effect for each sample. And at the end of the day, this optimal composition factor simply becomes a function of the design effect and sample sizes from these two various samples. All right, let's set the mathematical jargon aside and see how we can actually implement this. So the way it works is that you have a probability-based sample and you want to blend it with a non-probability-based sample. The first thing you want to do is that you want to take your probability sample, respondents from that sample, weight it to the geodemographic distributions of the target population, and hopefully as part of your survey you have included a few outcome measures that are related to the topic of the survey. And once you have weighted your probability-based sample component, you would also develop some benchmarks for those particular outcome measures. Then you would go to your non-probability sample and weight it to the geodemographic distributions that were used to weight the probability sample, as well as adding in as part of that adjustment, typically a raking adjustment, benchmarks that were generated from the probability-based sample component. And then for each of these resulting samples, you have a probability-based sample and a non-probability sample. You compute the so-called weighting, unequal weighting effect, design effect, whatever you want to call it. And here is a formula for that. It's basically the coefficient of variation of the weights for each of the two samples squared. Next, you would compute the effective sample size, which is nothing but the original sample size divided by the design effect. And this is where we pay to the weighting piper, if you will, meaning that the non-probability sample that is going to receive a lot more weighting adjustments is going to produce larger design effects, and therefore its effective sample size is going to be reduced more than what happens to the probability-based sample. And then you can go ahead and rescale the weights for the probability sample and non-probability sample to their respective effective sample sizes. And then you can then stack the two survey data with the rescaled weights and go about your analyses. If you want, you can also add this cosmetic adjustment whereby the weights are going to be rescaled one more time so that they add up to the total sample size N1 plus N2. So this is it. This is pretty much the money slide. This explains how you can go about blending samples in an optimal fashion. Otherwise, what is routinely used, the suboptimal fashion, is people take individual samples, weight them to the geodemographics that they have available. They stack up the samples, 2, 3, as many of them as they have, and then they will go ahead and produce analyses from that combined or stacked up data set. The issue here is that this simplistic methodology is based on the assumption that the variability of the weights in the two samples are equal. The design effect or unequal weighting effect are equal, which is to say that you can, again, simply combine the two samples proportional to their sizes. The issue with this simplistic approach is that it does not recognize that the probability-based sample component has better representativity, has better inferential integrity, and therefore it gives the same voice to respondents who come from the probability sample as well as those that come from the non-probability sample, which is not fair. And if you have a large non-probability sample, this simplistic methodology can pretty much dwarf your probability-based sample component. And in general, it kind of promotes sloppy sampling only to save costs. Again, I mentioned that this is not a webinar on non-probability sampling. However, again, because most of the hybrid sampling happens when we mix probability and non-probability samples, I think it's important to point out a few details if you have to deal with non-probability samples. So this is a simple schematic that shows how we can go about minimizing the total survey error, that big picture we mentioned at the beginning. You want to make sure that your non-probability samples are selected based on some pragmatic sampling, and I will explain what I mean by that. We need to have online friendly questionnaires. Again, in this context, when we talk about hybrid sampling, we are typically talking about supplementing a probability sample with a non-probability sample from online panels, and therefore having a online friendly questionnaire is important. Then the need for effective weighting and calibration becomes more pronounced, and of course you need to be careful about how you go about analytics and reporting. So what do we mean by pragmatic sampling when it comes to selecting samples from online panels? Novice researchers often get carried away and they over-engineer their code system when they select samples from online panels, not recognizing that that practice can be fairly expensive, and it can actually backfire. You can quickly run out of available panels to sample from. And a more serious problem is that it can lead to some creative shortcuts that panel providers may take without your information. So what do I mean by pragmatic sample balancing? If you're talking about a general population survey, what seems to work is a simple coda structure where you balance gender nested with age, some control on race ethnicity, also some control on geography so that all of your respondents don't come from Northeast, and then also anything on socioeconomic control such as education or income are highly recommended. So it is advisable not to get carried away again in terms of sample balancing and leave finer balancing to weighting and calibration. For one thing, most of these panels don't have all the profile data that you need for sample balancing. And besides, detailed multidimensional balancing is only possible through weighting, specifically rating adjustments. In terms of online questionnaire, again, an important feature with online samples, it's important to recognize that the days of long and arduous questionnaires are over. Most of these panel members take surveys on smartphones, and I don't have to tell you how limited that space is for survey design and administration. And the other thing is that most of these panel members are pretty survey savvy, and as soon as they see a poorly designed questionnaire, they just walk away. So poor questionnaires can increase break-offs, or it can promote suboptimal survey taking behaviors such as speeding, straight-lining, or other related issues. And it's also important to note that incentives can go only so far, right? As questionnaire length becomes longer and longer, you need to have more and more incentive, which can become very cost prohibitive, very fast. And then on the other hand, there are studies that show that incentives may not necessarily improve the quality of data. So don't bank on incentives and be careful about that. And at the same time, when it comes to using online panels for sampling, keep in mind that you may have to include a few additional questions for calibration, and we'll get to that in a minute as what do we mean by additional calibration adjustments. So multivariate calibration is to make whatever we can do to reduce bias so that the available inferential machinery could be used. However, as I mentioned, samples that lack organic representation from these online panels, even if you weight them to the geodemographic distributions, they're still going to have issues. Here is a list of measures with respect to which respondents from online panels differ from the general population. And as you see, it's a long list of measures that weighting cannot effectively address. Now, you cannot include a question about each one of these measures in the hopes of using them for calibration to make your respondents from online panels to be more representative. So you have to be parsimonious about that. We had conducted a series of studies way back then showing that when it comes to differentiating between respondents who come from online panels, non-probability samples, and the general population or probability samples, there are a handful of heavy hitters, a few major differentiators. And we've done various analyses to reach at this parsimonious subset. And it seems that what has been working for us is that for most general population surveys, you want to make a correction when it comes to using respondents from online panels. You want to make correction in terms of the time they spent surfing the web. Online panel members tend to spend significantly more time on the web for personal use. They spend more time watching TV. They have a higher propensity for being early adopters. They seem to relocate more often. They are more transient. They tend to be more interested in expressing their opinions online. And so these are some of the differentiators that you need to correct for when it comes to adding additional adjustments, attitudinal or behavioral adjustments to your weighting methodology so that respondents from non-probability samples from online panels are becoming more representative. And of course, there are all sorts of geodemographic differences between respondents that are coming from organic representation, probability-based samples, and these online panels. But I have highlighted this in blue to indicate that these are the corrections that we typically account for as part of the geodemographic weighting adjustments. The moral of this slide is that beyond geodemographics, you need to make some attitudinal behavioral adjustments to respondents who come from online panels to make them more like the general population. And then in terms of effective analysis, obviously survey estimates are subject to sampling error. We typically rely on margin of error as a measure of uncertainty due to sampling, and survey estimates need to be interpreted only in light of their error margins. In terms of methodologies that are available for estimating error margins on the commercial side, sometimes researchers don't even bother reporting error margin and simply produce point estimates and make inferences without any reference to the uncertainty of that point estimate. A somewhat refined but still simplistic approach is to assume that sample is selected in a simple random fashion and no weights are applied. So for example, when you're producing estimates of population percentages, you can use this simple formula. A yet more refined approach is to recognize that weights are involved and therefore don't use the unweighted sample size and instead use the effective sample size, that unequal weighting effect that I mentioned, and therefore reflect that with weighted data there is more uncertainty and hence reflect that in your inferential procedures. Better yet, rely on software packages that have procedures developed specifically to deal with weighted data. If you're a SAS user, SPSS data or whatever, there are specific procedures designed for working with weighted data. And then I like to mention a couple of quick points about these online online panels. I call it the Home Depot syndrome. Many researchers think that they can go to an online provider and provide some basic specs and get data that they can run with. Not recognizing that with online panels, often you have to worry about poor respondents. These are speeders, straight liners, and professional survey takers. And then also on top of that, you have to worry about fraudulent respondents. And fraudulent respondents come in two flavors. They can be the so-called bots. You can actually go online and purchase a software, and this software would allow you to go and take online surveys forever and ever and collect whatever incentives that such surveys provide. And that's where incentive and providing high incentives can backfire. We have come up a long way and have reasonable ways of dealing with these automated fraudulent respondents. What is still a serious problem and continues to be a serious problem are the so-called click farms. These are individuals who are actually sitting behind a bunch of cell phones, tablets, whatever, taking surveys by clicking away without even paying attention, simply to get to the end of the survey and collect the incentive. And there are other forms of these click farms, and these are situations where we have really tough time, and unless you're careful, you can end up with a whole bunch of fraudulent respondents when you go to online panel providers. All right, let me conclude by sharing a few pontifications with you, if I may. Obviously, times are changing. What that means is that traditional sampling methods are revealing more and more of their problems in terms of coverage, non-response, and cost. And at the same time, alternative methods of sampling, hybrid sampling being one, are becoming more and more attractive. And at the same time, as our analytical needs begin to evolve, we may get into situations where structured surveys cannot accommodate all the analytical needs. I make a distinction between market researchers who are on the commercial side and the survey researchers. Those on the ultra right of market research tend to subscribe to the point of view that traditional surveys have already become obsolete. Data need to be captured digitally through data fusion, through big data. They seem to be quick in terms of chasing the shiny objects. And they state that structured surveys fail to produce some of the nuances, such as point of sales information that might be very important to market research. On the other hand, I make the distinction between market researchers and traditional survey researchers. These are individuals who may still be operating based on the 1960s, 1970s realities. They don't like non-probability samples. They think that they are void of any inferential integrity. And because they think that marketing research techniques are beneath the survey research world, and they often bank too much on weighting, and they think that weighting can take care of any operational issues and challenges that we may encounter. How can we go about closing this divide? Again, no argument that times are changing. Perfect coverage and perfect response rates are gone. For example, the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, still insists on response rates that are north of 80%, yet there is no single survey, even government surveys, that can produce 80% response rates. Days of long and arduous surveys are over. I know it's a tough conversation with your clients, but if your survey goes over 15, 20 minutes, you're basically collecting random numbers. And at the same time, it's important to note that alternative methods and data sources are here to stay and grow, so we can't avoid them. So what is a pragmatic approach moving forward? I think it's important to recognize the fundamental strengths of traditional methods. We are not going to throw out the baby with the bathwater. At the same time, it's important to respect and recognize what alternative methods can add to the picture. We have to do that while recognizing shortfalls of these alternative methods and be fully transparent about them. Again, I can't stress this enough. Days of long, arduous surveys are over. Surveys need to be as lean and mean as possible. Otherwise, respondents either will break off or they just provide non-differentiating responses to your questions. And at the same time, it's important to note that survey data can be supplemented by ancillary data that could be secured from reliable sources. With that, I thank you for your time. And again, here is my contact information. If there are any questions, if there is anything that I left unanswered, or if there was anything that wasn't made clear enough, feel free to contact me, and I will be happy to respond to your questions. Thanks again, and have a great day.